Before recording episode number 1, we cut the intro, which was basically whenever we go to an airport event, we always start by asking people, "What do you want?" Which is a silly question, right? I mean, that's why we cut it. They don't know. And if you were to press, they would say, well, they'd prefer the airplanes to go somewhere else. And if you want to be real annoying, you press again and ask, okay, but what if you can't have that? But what if you could ask the airport for anything else? What would you ask for? And they either go, get away, or they look at you. You know that confused thing that dogs do? The city of Des Moines is restarting its airport committee on Monday. Here's the agenda, and the first question, of course, is why are you here and what do you hope to get out of it? And not to be snippy, we really do wish them success. But, the fact that Des Moines has been living next to Sea-Tac Airport since its incorporation in 1959 and does not have a clear answer on that, that should kind of tell you something. The problem is, the thing that people really want, changing flight paths, is like climbing Mount Everest. We use that metaphor a lot because you gotta climb some smaller mountains successfully before you tackle the big one. That's why people, and I mean across America, never win big battles. Anyone who begins by trying to summit Everest will die. So the first step is learning what those smaller climbs are, getting some wins under your belt, and learning what is achievable now. Last week, we called the process that prevents people from doing that a casino. But that's not what an airport really is. You know what an airport really is? A parking lot. Sea-Tac Airport is fundamentally a parking lot. In fact, it's 2 parking lots. A very small parking lot you call the airfield, and a much larger parking lot which we call Mickey and Friends. Because the most notable visual feature of the airport is the festive-looking structure built along with the second runway. And at the time, it surpassed Mickey and Friends, which was the Disneyland parking lot, as the largest enclosed commercial lot in all of America. It may still be. It's amazingly large. But the port never fails to mention that the airfield, the tiny parking lot, is indeed really small. But it does not take a lot of land to process a lot of airplanes. One of the things that people struggle with the most is wrapping their mind around the notion that the SAMP can yield so many more flights without building more runways. We encourage you to look at our presentation, The Factory, to explain this, but trust us, they have all the runway they will ever need. What the port desperately needs in order to process more planes, what most of the SAMP is about, more parking. And ain't that always the way? You schlep all the way downtown and still you can't find a parking space? Of course it's more complicated than renting a parking space in downtown Seattle. There are at least half a dozen major agreements that airlines sign on to individually and collectively in order to function. The whole system is worth talking about at some point. It's a bit like tenants at a shopping mall. They have to work together, but they're also keeping an eye out on one another and constantly thinking about how to attain more lucrative spots. And if you can't wait for a future episode to dive into that arcana, the place to go is always stni.info. It's good to think about it like a parking lot, because the moment an aircraft leaves its parking spot, a gate, a hard stand, whatever, it enters the taxiway system and comes under FAA control. The airport runs the parking areas, the gates and the ramps. The FAA runs everything else. Get it? The taxiways, the runways, the sky. The airport runs a parking lot, not the roads. And if you want to illustrate this by going off on a tabloid tangent, remember Richard Russell? The guy worked the ramp for Horizon, and in 2018, he got into a Park Q400 and simply flew away for his date with destiny. It was a surprisingly big deal around here. There were thousands of arguments and stories about, well, who's responsible? Horizon HR for being poor judges of character, the port for letting him steal a parked aircraft, or the FAA for somehow not preventing him from taking off into the wild blue yonder. Because once he got moving, he was supposedly under tower control. So after a lengthy investigation, you know what the FBI decided? Nobody. The port did institute a variety of security upgrades. Now, I just mentioned the airline tenants and something to do with malls, because if you look at the next biggest parking structure in the area, it's Southcenter Mall, built about the same time as Sea-Tac's second expansion. There are a number of worthwhile comparisons here, and we're going to run through them quick. First, both systems represent huge pieces of their respective cities' land area. They're both huge economic engines. Southcenter Mall also has not one, but two ginormous freeways that you could argue are just as impactful as the runways. Both cities have a series of agreements with their tenants, and the property owner works to help compensate various community impacts, stormwater, public safety, and so forth. Both have relatively small populations. And significantly, in both cases, the majority of that population is off to the side of the larger commercial area. But for Tukwila, both the positive and the negative impacts are really much better captured within city limits. And thankfully, the negative impacts stay within Tukwila's borders. Most people assume that because both those parking lots are inside city limits, they should not only receive all the benefits, but also the lion's share of any mitigation for negative impacts. And that's where it kind of gets a bit awkward. If you run any kind of stats on noise and pollution, both Tukwila and Sea-Tac are geographically organized to minimize the negative impacts for the majority of their populations. You can call it luck or genius planning, but it's simply the case that if you look at a map of port package eligibility, only 20% of people who were eligible for sound insulation were in Sea-Tac. If you believe that noise is something of a proxy for pollution, well, there you go. The city of Tukwila takes obvious environmental hits by being at the confluence of two major freeways. They don't control those freeways. Those are also controlled by federal law, but those are fixed pathways, and they have established and direct paths to state and federal mitigation funding. You can see that by the network of well-established air quality monitoring systems that have always been dedicated to freeways. There is nothing like that for aviation emissions. But of course, the airport's negative impacts radiate outwards 6, 10 miles in both directions. The only time we tend to even measure those impacts is during an expansion. The psychology of data collection betrays what we actually care about. Now, since the Port of Seattle makes the majority of its money off of the small parking lot, and the city of Sea-Tac makes a significant portion of its money off the larger one, both have every incentive in the world to process as many aircraft as possible in that system every day of the year. And just to be clear, the graphic I showed does not mean that Sea-Tac residents with sound insulation problems aren't suffering. Many of their port packages are among the worst. Still, Sea-Tac has received a boatload of compensation. That does not excuse their lack of advocacy on sound insulation, but it does explain why they haven't done more. The other cities, they don't even have that excuse. But don't blame the airport for things they can't control. Focus on what they actually can. Don't get hung up thinking it's like Southcenter, where only the city in which the system exists is entitled to be at the table. The Port of Seattle is a creature of the state running a federally regulated airport. It's not a private shopping mall. We know it feels like that to a lot of people, but it's not. So the first step is think about it like a parking lot. To punish this metaphor one last bit, let's say you had a 13,000 slot parking lot and every car turned on its engine and idled. All of those fumes and pollution and noise going up, that would not be the responsibility of the parking lot owner. Pollution from transportation is regulated not by the parking lot owner. It's regulated by the people who govern the streets. That situation is a fantasy, for parking lots. That does not happen. But that is the practical effect for airports, because the majority of pollution that affects people is obviously within the LTO, the landing and takeoff portion of the flight. It's this situation where you have a tremendous amount of pollution within this narrow area. That's where the parking lot thing breaks down. What can the parking lot do for cities other than Sea-Tac? A lot, and we're going to get there soon enough. But we thought we'd end today with this because we're talking so much about changing your mindset. Remember again that the entire noise abatement system is voluntary. We keep hitting on this because it's at the heart of the casino. It's intentionally voluntary. The port, like many airports, has had a fly quiet program for many years. It's actually started and stopped several times over the decades. People forget about it, then the next airport director brings it back as something new, and then they tell you how well they've been able to reduce flights between midnight and 5. Okay, that's great. START has been going since 2018, and for reasons passing understanding, nobody seems to notice that the entire Part 150 noise boundary, the one that determines sound insulation and stuff, the DNL 65, that DNL is predicated on 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. when people are, nighty noodle, not midnight to 5. So why would you limit a fly quiet program to 5 hours? We've watched every freaking START meeting since it began, and until last month, no one even ask that question. The answer is, of course, if you look at the flight schedule, if you look at our noise maps tool, 10 to midnight is one of the more lucrative times of day for the airport, especially because it means international travel to China, Asia, which is like their most profound market opportunity going forward. Think about that for a minute. 5 to 7, of course, is the traditional early rush at the East Coast. Now, the port has always said, and I believe them, that they have been diligently negotiating with the airports since 2018 to limit flights during that midnight to 5 period. And because it's voluntary, they were rebuffed over and over again, but they kept at it. And over time, they contend, and I believe them again, that the number of flights, they were able to get them slowly reduced, and now even that 2:30 a.m. thing that everybody complained about so much has been replaced with a much quieter flight. Very cool. That's progress. But since the system is voluntary, that means you could just expand it from 10 to 7, just by asking, which is what Fly Quiet has been all along. Will airlines say no? Of course. But they now have a track record of slowly but slowly changing hearts and minds. Keep up the great work. But you can never again say that reducing nighttime flights is impossible. And you do want to reduce nighttime flights, don't you? The fact is that other airports do have expanded Fly Quiet hours. That's how we knew about it. And the fact is, we talked about it last week with the casino, is that people are generally uninformed about this casino and don't even recognize that there are a whole bunch of other casinos and they all have a variety of rules. So our message for today is start asking for things. Think about what you want. You can ask for anything that is legally under the airport controls. You just have to know, wait for it, what to ask for. But when you jump straight to changing flight paths, the port and any airport operator are thrilled. They're happy to provide you with everything you need to attack Mount Everest because they know it's impossible and it's cost-free for them, and it will keep you occupied while they keep doing what they do. And we don't fault them because you cannot expect them to help you do things that would cost them more money. The airport is a parking lot. It may look a bit like a mall or other things, but it's not. The owner controls the parking lot, not the streets. Once you understand this, there's a lot more you can actually get simply by knowing what to ask for and then deciding to ask for it.